Welcome to the Digital Identity Digest, the audio companion to the blog at Spherical Cow Consulting. I'm Heather Flanagan, and every week I break down interesting topics in the field of digital identity, from credentials and standards to browser weirdness and policy twists. If you work with digital identity but don't have time to follow every specification or hype cycle, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. Welcome back. So a few weeks ago, someone challenged me with what sounded like a pretty simple question: what makes a successful standard? Now, I've been working in the standards development space for a while, so surely this was not a difficult thing to answer. The question came out of a concern that in a particular working group, quite a bit of development was happening, but it wasn't where the working group could see it. And since my focus tends to be on the standards process, that rather than on implementation and adoption, it occurred to me that I really needed to sit down and think this through. Where does the balance actually sit between real-world testing and formal standards development, and what actually leads to a quote-unquote successful standard? Now, the easy answer is, well, a standard is successful if it is adopted or implemented, really was just one part of the definition of success, and I felt that there was a lot more to it than that. But I don't think I was particularly clear as I talked this through with a few people, and a blog post is created. Now, success in standard work is often measured by, was the thing actually used? Was it adopted? It's a relatively easy metric to aim for, but it's a very difficult one to verify. In most standards organizations, there isn't reliable telemetry. You can't actually measure, was something adopted or not. Standards organizations rarely, if ever, have a dashboard that indicates who is running this thing in production and how is it going. At best, we have anecdotes, we have conference talks, and we have the occasional public deployment. But at worst, we don't actually have anything at all. There are no standards police. No one is required to report that they are doing this thing. Now, even when usage signals do exist, they can be kind of misleading. Large deployments often reflect market power as much as technical fitness. So early adoption can end up locking in assumptions that later prove kind of brittle. And some of the most widely discussed specifications have shown impressive activity inside the standards bodies while struggling to gain meaningful traction outside of them. So, if adoption is kind of a lagging and imperfect signal, the more useful question is not simply whether a standard is used, it's what conditions make meaningful adoption possible without distorting the work along the way. Because standards do not fail only when they are ignored, they also fail when the process quietly narrows down who can participate and what concerns are actually taken seriously. Now, before we go any further, it's pretty important to say something very, very clearly. There's a whole lot of value in what we're going to call implementation first cultures, right? Code is great for exposing fantasy fairly early because it reveals a lot of the hidden assumptions that will come about when you're talking about a clean, pure model. It surfaces performance cliffs, integration pain, edge cases that look like they might be manageable on paper, but when you actually try and write it into code, it doesn't work. So a specification that cannot be implemented really shouldn't advance. That's not a controversial statement, right? That's just basic hygiene. Implementation experience also protects against different failure modes. So the paper perfect but reality hostile specification. Standards work that remains purely conceptual can drift towards lovely, elegant abstractions that actually collapse the moment they meet legacy systems, regulatory constraints, or operational budgets. Running code forces contact with the messy parts of the world where specifications must ultimately survive. So, ideal worlds, they're lovely. I've yet to meet anyone who actually lives and works in one. And for many developers, working code is the only credible signal that something is real. Specifications without implementations feel academic, optional, something you can safely ignore. Implementation first cultures help standards avoid becoming interesting, but ultimately irrelevant. And all of that definitely matters. Implementations keep standards honest. But, and this is where things get uncomfortable, honesty is not the same thing as health. The problem is not implementation first in principle. I can easily see the value there. The problem emerges when implementation becomes a gatekeeping mechanism. Now, in some environments, concerns are only taken seriously if they arrive with running code. Use cases are treated kind of as hypothetical until someone has invested the engineering time to prove them out. The implicit message shifts from help us make this work for you to something closer to prove that you deserve to be here. And that shift changes who actually participates, not necessarily who is right, but who has the time, the budget, and the organizational permission to experiment publicly. It privileges teams that can move quickly and absorb the cost of being wrong. It disadvantages regulated actors, risk averse sectors, and individuals who cannot commit their employer to exploratory implementation work. It also creates kind of a quieter distortion in the specifications, right? Because early implementations tend to shape the mental model of the spec itself. The first working code becomes more the reference behavior, the obvious path, the examples that others are measured against. Even when that implementation reflects one organization's constraint, one deployment environment, or one particular threat model, it exerts an interesting gravitational pull on the rest of the work. Now, gravitational pulls can be overcome, but it does take time and sustained effort. Now, perhaps most importantly, implementation-gated cultures penalize a particular kind of expertise, the ability to see failure modes early. The people most capable of identifying where a specification will break are often the least willing to write code for something they already know is not going to meet their needs. Now, one of my favorite early questions in standards work is, what could possibly go wrong? It's a useful counterbalance to the very human instinct to celebrate what can be built. Requiring implementation as proof of legitimacy can turn that foresight into a barrier for participation. Now, implementation first cultures absolutely keep the standards grounded, but when implementation becomes the price of admission, they narrow the diversity of thought in the room, and standards are at their weakest when the room gets smaller. Now, there's another tension here that shows up whenever we're trying to bring more implementation-focused people into the standards conversation, right? Many developers are not actually looking to co-design the future of the web or identity infrastructure. They want something off the shelf, something free, something available across browsers and platforms, something that works now. They're not especially interested in paying the coordination cost of what should this ecosystem look like? They would prefer that question already be settled, not their problem. Now, that doesn't mean that collaboration is impossible. Some developers are deeply engaged in shaping the systems that they depend on, but that partnership is often fragile and kind of situational, and it does not scale easily to the broader developer population. And the result is a fairly persistent tension that high levels of activity in a working group and community forums do not necessarily translate into real-world deployment, and conversely, meaningful progress in the market can sometimes occur through quieter, more bilateral collaboration that never shows up as broad public participation. If success is measured only by participation inside the standards process, you're going to get a misleading picture. But if it's only measured by deployment scale, the picture is actually fairly incomplete. So one useful diagnostic lens, I guess you could call it, comes from the familiar prioritization principle at the W3C that says users first, developers second, platforms third, and technical purity last. In the identity space, the stakeholders are more nuanced than that. There's users, relying parties, identity providers, browser engines. Each are experiencing the system differently and optimizing for different risks. Standards efforts sometimes invert these hierarchies without realizing it because technical elegance and implementer alignment becomes the primary signals of success. And that inversion is not usually because of neglect or bad intent. It happens because representation from that top of the hierarchy, what do the users need, is sparse, assuming it's present at all. The people who regularly participate in standards work are rarely representative of typical end users. And many developers, understandably focused on shipping a product, do not have the time or incentive to engage deeply in standards development. Given that reality, agreement among standards participants can become the most visible and measurable proxy for success. And from inside the room, strong implementer alignment can feel like very healthy progress, and sometimes it is, but not always. But wait, there's more. Another tension underneath all of this that standards groups don't necessarily talk about is, should a specification reflect only what has already been proven through implementation? Or is it allowed to be at least somewhat aspirational, capturing where the group believes the ecosystem needs to go? Now, on the surface, the implementation first answer is fairly appealing. If the spec only documents what has already been built and tested, the adoption risk appears much lower, and interoperability is much easier to demonstrate. So the path to deployment feels pretty clear. But that sort of purely descriptive approach has its own failure modes, right? If standards only ever ratify existing practice, they risk becoming little more than documentation of the status quo, which can be useful. Sometimes it can be extremely useful, but it does limit the ability of standards work to smooth ecosystem transitions, to address known structural gaps, or to create coordination points that emerging architectures may require. Now, in fast moving spaces like digital identity, waiting for the full market convergence before standardizing can mean that the window for meaningful interoperability has already narrowed. At the same time, aspirational specifications carry a whole lot of risk, right? When a group gets too far ahead of deployable reality, the work can drift into something that looks coherent on paper, but proves costly or impractical to implement. I mean, the industry certainly has seen more than one technically elegant design struggle because it asks the ecosystem to move faster than the incentives or the budgets would support. The productive space, uncomfortable as it is, lies somewhere in between those things, in between that aspiration and documenting reality. Healthy standards work does tend to be implementation informed, but it still needs to set direction. It grounds itself in what has been proven possible while still leaving room to guide the ecosystem towards better interoperability, stronger security properties, or more sustainable architectural patterns. It's a pretty delicate balance, no two ways about that. If you lean too far towards pure documentation and the standard arrives after the market has already fragmented, that's not great. If you lean too far towards aspiration, the work risks becoming admired. Gosh, that's sure pretty, but it's not going to be used. So none of this actually negates the longstanding wisdom that reputable standards bodies look for, right? They look for multiple independent implementations before declaring success. And that principle is worth its weight in platinum. Competing implementations surface ambiguities, expose hidden assumptions, and help ensure that the specification is not simply a thin wrapper around one vendor's architecture. Size of deployment is informative, but it is not sufficient. A single dominant implementation can certainly demonstrate viability, but it can also mask interoperability risks or ecosystem constraints that only emerge under competition. Standards work is, at its core, about coordination under uncertainty. It succeeds when the resulting specification can survive contact with multiple business models, multiple regulatory environments, and multiple technical stacks. And that kind of resilience very rarely comes from a monoculture deployment. Now, part of the confusion in how we talk about success comes from borrowing product thinking a little too literally, right? Products optimize for speed, differentiation, and user acquisition. And they can succeed by being good enough for a well defined market. They can ignore edge cases for years if the core experiences deliver value. Standards, I think, operate under a different constraint. They are long lived coordination mechanisms. They must care about the long tail earlier than most products would prefer to do. They succeed not only by enabling present value, but by constraining future harm and reducing ecosystem friction over time. A specification should absolutely be informed by real products and real deployments, but when a single product experience begins to define the boundaries of the standard itself, the process risks mistaking local optimization for global fitness. So think of it this way. Products should answer the question, does this work for us? Standards should answer the question, what breaks when others try to use this? They are related questions, but they are not the same question. So if adoption alone is insufficient and participation metrics are easy to misread, then what does success actually look like for a standard? Okay, you've been with me this far, so here's my current working answer. It looks like a process where credible disagreement can be expressed without prohibitive cost, where use cases are treated as early warning signals rather than feature requests to be negotiated away. where implementation experience informs the work without becoming the sole currency of legitimacy, where competing implementations reveal real interoperability surface, and where the resulting specification survives contact with environments that were not in the room when it was written. None of this is clean. None of this produces a single satisfying metric. But I don't think standards have ever been about clean metrics. They're about building enough shared reality that independent actors can move forward without constant renegotiation. I don't think standards fail because people disagree. I think they fail when disagreement becomes too expensive to express. With that, this was a bit longer than usual. Thank you so much for listening, and tune in next week for the next episode. And that's it for this week's episode of the Digital Identity Digest. If it helps make things a little clearer, or at least a little more interesting, share it with a friend or colleague and connect with me on LinkedIn at HL Flanagan. And if you enjoyed the show, do be sure to subscribe and leave me a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find the written full post at sphericalcowconsulting.com. Now stay curious, stay engaged, and let's get these conversations going.